My mom beamed at her birthday party, then dropped a sentence that froze the room. The best gift would be you leaving my life. I didn't cry. I smiled quietly, froze the account, sold everything, and vanished into the rain. She didn't know. I took her entire future with me. The air in Bend, Oregon, always smelled of juniper and high desert dust, but inside my mother's house the scent was strictly lemon polish and suppressed resentment. It was Eleanor's 64th birthday, a milestone she wore like a heavy velvet cloak. I had spent 6 hours in the kitchen, my hand stained purple from the marionberries I'd hand-picked for her favorite pie. I wanted the night to be perfect, a desperate attempt to patch the widening cracks in our foundation. The dining room glowed under the amber hum of the chandelier my father had installed 40 years ago, casting long, flickering shadows against the pine-paneled walls that seemed to lean in, listening to our every word. The guests were a collection of Eleanor's inner circle, Cassie and Megan, my cousins, who always spoke in hushed, pitying tones, and a few neighbors who remembered me only as the boy who stayed behind while the rest of the world moved on. I served the pan-seared halibut with a precision that bordered on clockwork. I was 28, a man whose life had become a series of errands, pharmacy runs, and clinical appointments. Every time I reached for a glass or offered a refill, Eleanor's eyes followed me sharp and calculating as if she were measuring the exact cost of my presence in her home. She had a way of making the air feel expensive, as if I were breathing oxygen I hadn't earned. To Eleanor, Cassie toasted her voice high and brittle, the sound of glass about to snap. For being the heart of this family, even when things got difficult. She looked at me when she said difficult. I smiled, a practiced mask that felt like dry parchment on my face. I had moved back from my MFA program 3 years ago when Eleanor claimed her hip was failing, that the house was too big to manage alone, and that the shadows were growing too long for her to face without help. I traded my brushes for a library shift and a grueling schedule of domestic duty. I was the good son, the anchor that kept her world from drifting, the one who sacrificed his canvases for her comfort. The dinner had been a performance of high-stakes civility. We discussed the local weather, the rising property taxes in Deschutes County, and the way the deer were eating the pansies in the front yard. But beneath the surface there was a jagged current. Eleanor had been colder than usual, her critiques of the food more pointed, her size more theatrical. She complained the halibut was a second too long in the pan, and that the wine lacked the body of the vintages my father used to stock. I took it all in silence, a sponge for her dissatisfaction, believing that if I just worked harder, if I was just a bit more perfect, the bitterness would finally drain from her. Eleanor stood up slowly, her posture arrow straight despite the ornate cane leaning against her Chera cane. I knew she didn't actually need to support her weight, but used to command attention. She didn't look at the guests. She looked directly at the head of the table where my father used to sit, the empty space that still felt like a wound in the room. Then she turned that cold blue gaze onto me. The room went silent, the kind of heavy pressurized silence that precedes a lightning strike in the high desert. Age brings clarity. She began, her voice steady and melodic, the refined tone she used for church fundraisers and garden club meetings. And at 64, I realized that some weights are simply too heavy to carry. Caleb, you've been so devoted. She paused, letting the word hang in the air like a foul odor. But the best gift I could receive tonight, the only thing I truly want, is you leaving my life. Completely. For good. I am tired of looking at your face and seeing the ghost of a life I no longer want to lead. I want my house back. I want my silence back. I want you gone by morning. The sound of a fork hitting a china plate echoed like a gunshot in the small room. Cassie gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if she were the one being struck. Megan stared at her wine glass, her eyes fixed on the red liquid as if a map of her own escape were written in the dregs. I felt the heat rise to my neck, not from anger, but from a sudden, terrifying realization the performance was finally over. The script I had been following for years, the one where I was the selfless protector and she was the fragile victim, had been shredded in front of everyone I knew. I didn't argue. I didn't remind her of the thousands of hours I had spent tending to her imaginary ailments, or the career I had abandoned to ensure she never felt lonely. I simply stood up the chair, scraping against the hardwood floor with a harsh, final sound that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my shoes. I looked at the Marionberry pie, still cooling on the sideboard, its crust golden and fluted a masterpiece of wasted effort for a woman who viewed my existence as a debt she was tired of collecting. "Happy birthday, Mother," I said. My voice was quieter than I expected, devoid of the tremor I usually felt in her presence. It was the voice of someone who had already left. I walked into the kitchen, the linoleum, cold and clinical beneath my feet. I ran my hands under the tap, letting the freezing mountain water numb the purple stains on my fingers. Outside, the high desert rain began to fall, a steady rhythmic drumming on the roof that sounded like an army of small feet marching away. I grabbed my old leather jacket from the hook by the back door, the one she had tried to donate to charity 3 times because it didn't fit her aesthetic, and stepped out into the dark. I didn't look back at the glowing windows of the theater I had just exited. I didn't wait for her to call me back with a scripted apology or a manipulative sob. The anchor hadn't just been lifted. It had been cut. And for the first time in my adult life, I was drifting into a storm I had finally chosen for myself. The silence of the local library at 6:00 a.m. was the only sanctuary I had left. I sat in the glow of a flickering monitor, my eyes burning from a lack of sleep, staring at the digital portal of Cascadia Trust Bank. For years, I had handed my paychecks over to the joint account, believing we were a team fighting against the rising costs of her recovery. But after the birthday massacre, the fog in my mind had cleared, replaced by a cold, sharp instinct. I typed in the password, my father's birthday, and waited for the numbers to load. What I saw made the blood in my veins turn to slush. The account wasn't just low, it was a crime scene. Every month, like clockwork, there were withdrawals of $2,000 labeled as home maintenance or medical specialist. But the vendors weren't contractors or doctors. I cross-referenced the transaction codes. They were transfers to a private investment portfolio and a boutique travel agency in Portland. Eleanor hadn't been struggling to pay for her hip treatments. She had been building a fortress of wealth using my labor as the mortar. Over 5 years, she had siphoned off nearly $120, Zare's own money I thought was keeping us afloat, money that should have been my tuition, my future, my life. I leaned back, the plastic chair creaking in the empty library. The betrayal felt physical, a dull ache behind my ribs. But the paper trail didn't end at the bank. I opened the county's property records. My father had always told me the house was mine, a legacy to ensure I'd always have a place to create. I found the deed digitized and stark. Caleb Bennett, sole owner. There was no mention of Eleanor. She had stayed in that house not by right but by my permission, a permission she had manipulated out of me through a carefully crafted web of frailty. I stood up and walked to the medical archives section, pulling the dusty binders of local clinic reports from 3 years ago. I remembered the day she fell on the slopes above Bend. I found the discharge papers. Patient Eleanor Bennett Minor, soft tissue bruising. Full mobility expected within 6 days. No long-term impairment indicated. 6 days. She had turned 6 days of bruising into 3 years of domestic servitude. She had sat in that mahogany chair wincing every time I asked her to walk while her medical records laughed at my gullibility. I felt a surge of nausea. Every meal I cooked, every night I stayed awake listening for her call. Every dream I deferred was based on a lie so profound it felt like a haunting. I left the library and drove to the outskirts of town where the old Hargrove estate sat nestled among the pines. Mrs. Hargrove was 80 sharp as a hawk, and the only person Eleanor couldn't intimidate. I found her in her garden, clipping dead lavender. She didn't look up when I approached, but her voice was steady. "I wondered when you'd finally stop being the ghost in that house, Caleb," she said, her shears snapping with a rhythmic clip. "You knew?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Everyone knew, dear. We saw her at the market when you were at work. She didn't use that cane for anything but pointing at things she wanted to buy. She's a collector of people, and she collected you because you were the most valuable piece in your father's collection." She reached into her pocket and handed me a small weathered envelope. This came to my house by mistake 2 years ago. I tried to give it to her, but she told me it was just junk mail and to burn it. I kept it because I don't like the way she smiles when she lies. I opened the envelope. It was a letter from the Rhode Island School of Design. Dear Mr. Bennett, we are pleased to inform you that your request for a deferral has been denied, but your full tuition scholarship remains active for the upcoming semester should you choose to enroll. I stopped breathing. I had never requested a deferral. I had told Eleanor I couldn't go because we couldn't afford it and she was too sick. She had intercepted my mail, forged my signature, and killed my opportunity before I could even grasp it. She hadn't just used me for my money, she had systematically dismantled every bridge that led away from her. She's been editing you, Caleb, Mrs. Hargrove said finally, looking me in the eye. Every time you tried to grow, she pruned you back so you'd fit in her garden. It's time you realize that a house built on lies isn't a home, it's a cage. I walked back to my car, the letter clutched in my hand so tightly the edges tore. The grief was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I wasn't just going to leave. I was going to dismantle the stage she performed on. I looked at the bank app on my phone. The freeze button was a small blue icon. I pressed it. Then I dialed the number for Arthur Sterling, the most ruthless estate lawyer in the state. Mr. Sterling, I said, watching the rain streak across my windshield. My name is Caleb Bennett. I own a house in Bend that I need to vacate and sell immediately. And I need to ensure the current occupant is legally removed without a cent of my father's money in her pocket. As I drove back toward the house, the pine trees looked different, no longer like guardians but like witnesses. I looked at the passenger seat where the paper trail lay, spread out the bank statements, the deed, the forged letter, the medical truth. For 28 years I had been a character in Eleanor's play. I was tired of the role. I was going to rewrite the ending, and for the first time I wouldn't be asking for her permission to speak the truth. The paper trail was my map, and it led straight out of Bend. The smell of cedar and old paper in Arthur Sterling's office was the first thing that felt solid in weeks. Arthur sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of oak, his eyes scanning the documents I had retrieved from the library and Mrs. Hargrove. He didn't offer me pity, which I appreciated. In the legal world of Central Oregon, Arthur was known as a man who preferred ironclad facts over emotional pleas. He tapped the deed to the house with a polished fountain pen, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Your father was a meticulous man, Caleb, Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't just leave you a house, he left you a fortress. This deed is fee simple, the highest form of ownership. Your mother has no life estate, no dower rights, and certainly no legal authority to manage your finances. What she's been doing with the Cascadia Trust account isn't just a betrayal, it's elder-to-younger financial exploitation. I sat across from him, feeling the weight of the ghost of father in the room. I remembered my dad in his woodshop, the way he'd run his thumb over a dovetail joint to check for gaps. He believed things should fit perfectly, that the structure of a life should be honest. He had built that house in Bend with his own hands, selecting every beam to withstand the weight of the snow and the passage of time. He had built it for me. I realized then that by letting Eleanor turn the house into a prison, I was desecrating the only thing he had left me. Shall fight, I said, my voice barely a whisper. She's built a narrative in this town. If I sell the house, I'm the monster who threw his sick mother onto the street. Arthur leaned forward, the light catching his silver hair. Then let her fight. But she'll be fighting the law, not your guilt. I've already drafted the notice to quit. Since there is no lease, she is technically a guest whose invitation has been revoked. As for the bank, the freeze is permanent until a full audit is conducted. You have the power here, Caleb. You've always had it, you just weren't allowed to look at the map. I left his office and drove back to the house, but I didn't go inside. I walked toward the back of the property to the detached workshop that had been locked since the day of my father's funeral. The key was hidden where it had always been, inside a hollowed-out knot in the doorframe. The lock turned with a heavy, rusted groan. Inside, the air was still frozen in a moment from 5 years ago. Sawdust still coated the workbenches like a fine layer of gray snow. My old canvases were stacked in the corner covered by a moth-eaten tarp. I pulled the tarp back. There was a half-finished portrait of my father, his eyes crinkled in a laugh that I had almost forgotten. Beside it sat the sketchbook I had closed at 22. I opened it. The last drawing was a rough sketch of the Oregon coastline craggy rocks and a lighthouse standing against a gale. I touched the charcoal lines, feeling a phantom ache in my fingers. This was the man I was supposed to be before Eleanor decided I was more useful as a servant. I saw the stacks of wood my father had seasoned walnut, cherry, and maple. Oh, he had saved them for the big projects, the ones we were going to build together when I finished school. The struggle inside me was a violent storm. A part of me, the part Eleanor had raised to be a martyr, wanted to go back into the kitchen, apologize for the birthday dinner, and pretend the bank statements didn't exist. It would be easy to slip back into the numbness. But then I looked at the workshop, the honest wood, and the unfinished art. Staying wasn't an act of love. It was an act of erasure. My father hadn't left me this property so I could watch it rot under the weight of a lie. He left it so I could build something of my own. I picked up a piece of scrap walnut and gripped it until the grain bit into my palm. The guilt was still there, a heavy cold stone in my stomach, but for the first time it was outweighed by a sense of duty, not to the living woman who was bleeding me dry, but to the dead man who had tried to set me free. "I'm sorry it took so long, Dad," I whispered to the empty shop. I walked out and locked the workshop door. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was a homeowner, a victim of fraud, and a man with a deadline. I looked at the main house, the white paint peeling the garden overgrown with weeds Eleanor refused to pull. It was a stage set for a tragedy that was finally closing. I pulled my phone out and messaged the real estate agent Arthur had recommended. "List it tomorrow," I wrote. "Unrestricted sale. Cash offers preferred." As I walked toward the back porch, I saw Eleanor watching me from the kitchen window. She was standing perfectly straight, her cane nowhere to be seen, her face a mask of cold fury. She knew. She had seen me go into the shop, seen the change in the way I carried my shoulders. The war was no longer silent. The ghost of my father had finally given me the permission I was too afraid to give myself. The house was mine, the money was mine, and the future was a canvas I was finally ready to prime. I stepped onto the porch, the wood solid and honest beneath my feet, and prepared to face the woman who had spent 5 years trying to make me disappear. The digital freeze at Cascadia Trust Bank hit like a shockwave. I was in the hallway when the first scream erupted from the kitchen. Eleanor was holding her phone, her face contorted in a way that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with lost control. "What did you do?" she shrieked, the cane she supposedly needed clattering to the floor as she took a predatory step toward me. "My card was declined. At the florist. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" "The account is frozen, Eleanor," I said, using her name for the first time. "And the house is being listed for sale. Arthur Sterling has already filed the paperwork." The air in the house seemed to thicken. The mask of the fragile, hip-injured mother dissolved completely, replaced by the woman who had forged my signatures and buried my dreams. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She narrowed her eyes and began to pace the slate floor, the very floor I had paid for with my library shifts. "You're nothing without me," she hissed. "You're a failed artist who couldn't even finish a degree. You think you can survive out there, you'll be back in a month begging for a room." "I won't," I said. By that afternoon, the phone started vibrating. It was Cassie first, then Megan. They didn't call to ask if I was okay, they called to scream. "How could you be so cruel, Caleb?" Cassie's voice was a jagged edge over the speaker. "She's a sick woman to kick her out of her own home. Have you lost your mind?" "It's my house, Cassie," I replied calmly. "And she hasn't been sick in 3 years. Did she tell you about the $120,000 she took or the RISD scholarship she hid from me?" "I don't care about your little conspiracies," Cassie snapped. "Family is family. You're destroying this name. If you do this, don't you ever call us again. You're dead to this family." "I think that's the point," I said and hung up. I spent the rest of the day in my room packing. I was meticulous. I didn't take the furniture she had bought with my money or the expensive modern decor that had erased my father's touch. I took my clothes, my journals, my father's old carpentry tools, and every canvas from the workshop. That night, the high desert rain returned with a vengeance, lashing against the siding. I walked through the house, checking every room. I saw the empty spaces on the walls where her investments hung. I saw the kitchen where I'd been a servant for 1,000 meals. The house felt like a hollow shell, a stage set after the final curtain had fallen. I reached my bedroom door and looked at the handle. For 3 years, this door had remained unlocked, a symbol of her constant access to my life, my thoughts, and my time. I stepped inside, closed it, and turned the lock. The click was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It wasn't just a piece of metal sliding into a strike plate, it was a boundary. It was the first no I had ever spoken that she couldn't bypass. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to her pacing in the hallway, her muffled curses the sound of her pouring a glass of wine she hadn't paid for. I didn't feel the guilt I expected. I felt a strange, cold clarity. The family loyalty they preached was a one-way street that led to my extinction. To them, I wasn't a person. I was a utility. At 3:00 a.m., I carried my boxes down the back stairs. I moved like a shadow, avoiding the floorboards I knew would creak. I loaded the truck I had rented, the rain soaking through my jacket, chilling me to the bone. It was a clean, honest cold. I walked back in one last time to leave the keys on the counter. Beside them, I placed a folder containing the medical discharge papers from 3 years ago and the bank statements showing her siphoning my life savings. I didn't leave a note. The evidence was the only language she respected. As I pulled the truck out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house stood dark against the Oregon sky except for the single amber light in the kitchen. Eleanor was standing there watching. She didn't wave, and neither did I. I turned onto the main road, the tires humming against the wet asphalt. Every mile I drove was a minute of my life I was reclaiming. I was leaving the theater, the script, and the lies. Ahead of me, the road toward Washington was black and open, a blank page waiting for the first stroke of a brush I was finally allowed to hold. The drive north was a blur of gray asphalt and towering Douglas firs that stood like silent sentinels along the interstate. By the time I crossed the Columbia River into Washington, the very chemistry of the air had changed. It was heavier, saltier, infused with the scent of the Pacific and the damp, ancient soil of the coast. I reached Bellingham just as the sun began to dip behind the San Juan Islands, casting a bruised purple light over the water that looked like ink spilled across a silk sheet. My new apartment was a stark, intentional contrast to the sprawling, pine-paneled prison I had left behind in Bend. It was a modest studio in an old brick building near the waterfront, where the hallways smelled of floor wax and the ghosts of 1,000 quiet lives. It had large industrial windows that faced the Puget Sound, framing a view of the world that felt infinite rather than enclosed. There was no lemon polish here, no heavy mahogany furniture to dust, and no lingering scent of Eleanor's expensive, suffocating perfumes. It was a space defined by its emptiness, and for the first time in my adult life that emptiness didn't feel like a lack, it felt like room to breathe. I spent the first few days in a state of hyper-awareness, a lingering side effect of living under siege for so long. Every time the radiator hissed or a neighbor's footsteps echoed in the hallway, my heart would hammer against my ribs, expecting a frantic call or a venomous confrontation. But I had changed my number before crossing the state line, and my new address existed only on a private lease agreement. The silence was unnerving at first, a vast, echoing void where a constant nagging pressure used to be. For the first time in years, my time belonged entirely to me. I didn't have to check the clock to see if it was time for Eleanor's heart medication or her evening tea. I didn't have to prepare my face for a performance of gratitude I didn't feel. I spent my mornings walking along the rocky shoreline of Post Point, watching the ferries drift across the gray water like slow, deliberate thoughts. The cold wind bit at my face, a sharp, cleansing reminder that I was alive, unencumbered, and physically distant from the lies of Central Oregon. In the afternoons, I began the slow process of unpacking my life. I set up my father's old carpentry bench in the corner of the room, the wood scarred and honest, and lined up my brushes on the windowsill like a row of small, hopeful soldiers. The canvases I had rescued from the workshop stood against the wall, their white surfaces intimidating in the afternoon light, but they no longer felt like accusations of failure. They felt like invitations. One Wednesday evening, I found myself standing outside a small community center in the Fairhaven district. I had seen a flyer for an open studio, sessional levels, welcome no prerequisites, just a willingness to start. My hands were shaking as I pushed open the heavy oak door, the old instinct to hide my passion still clawing at my throat. But when I stepped inside, the smell hit me, the intoxicating, earthy tang of turpentine linseed oil and wet clay. It was the smell of my 22-year-old self, a scent that felt more like home than any house I had ever lived in. The instructor was a woman named Maya, with paint-stained hands, and hair tied back in a messy knot that looked like it hadn't been brushed in days. She didn't ask for my credentials, my history, or why I looked like a man who had just escaped a shipwreck. She simply pointed to an empty easel in the back of the room. "Grab some charcoal," she said, her voice warm and gravelly seasoned by years of art and honesty. "We're working on light and shadow today. Don't worry about the form yet. Just find where the darkness meets the light." I sat down, the charcoal rough and messy between my fingers. I looked at the still life arrangement in the center of the room, a collection of salt-crusted driftwood jagged sea glass and a single stubborn wildflower in a mason jar. I didn't try to make it perfect. I didn't try to paint something that Eleanor would find marketable, or something that looked modern and expensive for her social circle. I just drew. I drew the jagged, broken edges of the wood, the way the light refracted through the imperfections in the glass, and the way the flower leaned toward the window, desperate for a sun it couldn't see. As the hours passed, the tension that had lived in my shoulders for 3 years began to dissolve. I wasn't Caleb the servant, or Caleb the failed artist, or Caleb the good son, who had been edited out of his own biography. I was just a man with a piece of charcoal translating the truth of what I saw onto paper. Back at the apartment, I stood on the small balcony and watched the lights of the harbor twinkle like fallen stars. The house in Bend had sold within 10 days, a cash offer that Arthur Sterling had handled with the surgical efficiency of a man who enjoyed justice. After paying off the legal fees and the debt Eleanor had accrued in my name, I had more money in my own private account than I had ever dreamed of. It was enough to pay for my tuition, my rent, and enough paint to cover every wall in this city. I looked at the sketchbook Maya had encouraged me to start. On the first page, I had drawn the fairy I saw every morning. It wasn't a masterpiece, but every line was mine. I realized then that freedom wasn't just the absence of Eleanor, it was the presence of myself. I was 28 years old, and for the first time I wasn't asking for permission to exist. I was starting over in a city of fog and salt, and as I watched a cargo ship disappear into the mist, I felt a strange, quiet joy. I was no longer a character in someone else's tragedy. I was the one holding the brush, and the canvas was finally beautifully blank. I was allowed to begin. The voicemail light on my new phone pulsed a steady, rhythmic, read a tiny, glowing heartbeat in the corner of my darkened studio. For 3 weeks I had ignored it, allowing the messages to stack up like unread chapters of a book I had already finished. But tonight the air in Bellingham was still the Puget Sound, a sheet of hammered silver under the moonlight, and I felt strong enough to listen to the ghost one last time. I pressed play. Eleanor's voice filled the room, sounding thinner than I remembered. The practiced vibrato of her manipulation turned up to a desperate frequency. "Caleb," she whispered, the sound of a clinking glass in the background. "The doctors, they found something. It's my heart this time. Real, actual damage. I'm truly sick, and I'm all alone in this apartment they forced me into. If you have any spark of the sun I raised left in you, you'll come home. I'll forgive you for everything. We can start over, please. I don't think I'll make it through the winter without you." I sat at my small wooden table, watching the way the moonlight hit my father's old carpentry tools. I felt the familiar pull, the old ingrained reflex to pack a bag and rush to her side. It was the guilt rope she had tied around my neck since childhood. But as the message ended, I didn't feel the panic. I didn't feel the crushing weight of duty. I felt a profound, quiet exhaustion. I picked up the phone, and for the first time since leaving Bend, I dialed her number. She picked up on the second ring, her breath hitching in a way that was perfectly timed for maximum pity. "Caleb," she breathed. "Is that you? Are you coming home?" "No, Eleanor," I said. My voice was calm, anchored by the salt air and the miles of forest between us. "I'm not coming back. I hope you seek the treatment you need, and I hope you find peace in the truth. But I am no longer the person you used to fill the holes in your own life. I've started my own." "You're killing me!" she suddenly shrieked, the fragility vanishing in a flash of familiar rage. "You're an ungrateful, selfish boy, after everything I sacrificed for you." "You didn't sacrifice for me," I interrupted, surprised by my own firmness. "You sacrificed me for you. There's a difference, goodbye, Mother." I hung up and felt the final thread snap. It didn't feel like a tragedy. It felt like a finished sentence. I walked over to the corner of the room where my newest canvas stood. I had spent the last week working on it, a large-scale piece titled Wildflowers. It wasn't a portrait or a landscape. It was an explosion of color and motion petals of deep violet ochre and crimson leaning into a gale, their stems angled with a stubborn, fierce resilience. They weren't perfect or modern. They were messy, vibrant, and alive. I picked up a palette knife and added one last stroke of bright, defiant gold to the center of a bloom. My hands were steady. The purple stains of the marionberry pie were long gone, replaced by the honest smudges of oil paint and charcoal. That night, I didn't dream of the white, sterile hallways of the house in Bend or the gray slate floors that felt like rain clouds. I dreamed of a yellow hall, sunlit and warm, where the air smelled of sawdust and possibility. I dreamed of a man walking through a door that he didn't have to lock because no one was trying to follow him. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm. I made a pot of coffee and sat by the window watching the first fairy of the day cut a white path through the mist. It was Wednesday, the night of Maya's class. I looked at my journal lying open on the table. The pages were no longer filled with bank statements or medical notes. They were filled with sketches of the harbor ideas for new canvases and a list of the things I wanted to see: the Olympic Mountains, the art galleries in Seattle, the inside of a classroom where I was the student, not the servant. I picked up my pen and wrote a single line on the last page of the first volume, "I Am No Longer Disappearing." I spent the afternoon at the Community Arts Center helping Maya prep the studio for the evening session. We didn't talk much, but the shared silence was comfortable, the kind of silence that exists between people who understand that the work is what matters. When the other students arrived, an eclectic mix of retirees, college kids, and weary professionals, I realized I wasn't the only one there trying to find a version of themselves that had been lost. I stood at my easel and looked at the blank canvas I had prepared. I didn't feel the old paralysis of perfection. I dipped my brush into a pool of deep oceanic blue and made the first mark. It was bold. It was certain. It was mine. As the sun began to set over Bellingham, casting a golden glow over the brick buildings and the salt-crusted docks, I walked home with my sketchbook tucked under my arm. The world felt wide honest and filled with a terrifying, beautiful freedom. I thought about the marionberry pie, the house in Bend, and the woman who had tried to make me a ghost. They were part of my history, but they were no longer my horizon. I reached my apartment and paused at the door. I didn't hesitate. I turned the key, stepped inside, and left the light off, letting the blue dusk fill the room. I stood on the balcony, breathing in the cold, salt-heavy air, and listened to the sound of the water. I was 28 years old. My father's tools were in the corner. My brushes were wet with paint, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who was writing the next chapter. I was Caleb Bennett, and I was finally allowed to begin.